SAP HANA Rules Framework provides rule services to manage rule execution and to maintain a stable interface in an environment in which business users are adding and changing rules. An application developer or implementer can construct a rule service that will determine which rules are to be evaluated by the service and on what data. Activation of a rule service generates a number of runtime artifacts that are executed when the rule service is called and the determination engine is triggered. These artifacts are stored procedures and/or views generated by the rules compiler that determine at runtime whether a rules condition evaluates to true. If so, it brings back the determination results and executes any actions that were defined in the rule. There are two types of rule service, and these are controlled by the execution context of the service. The first is event-driven, where input parameters are mapped to one or more data objects. The second is batch-driven, which typically includes a leading data object and employs filtering conditions. I will now create a rule service in the SAP HRF web interface and examine the basic components that can be provided. These are a service name and description, a consumption method, a vocabulary, an execution context. This consists of a resulting data object, unique key attributes of the data object, and an optional filter condition. There's also an output, which is optional, a rule assignment mode, an optional rule group, and the ability to add parameters as either simple parameters or as a data object. I will supply a rule service name and description and then explain each of the rule service parameters in further detail. The consumption artifact dropdown allows the business user to decide whether they want rules to be consumed by a procedure or allow the results to be available as a database view or both. I will choose both procedure and view. Choosing a vocabulary is a mandatory option. I will select the banking vocabulary I created in a previous lesson. It is possible to select only one vocabulary per rule service. We now need to define the execution context of the rule service. This is actually the data object on which I would like to ask questions. This involves selecting a particular data object that represents the business entity upon which rules will be evaluated. In this example, I'm going to choose the customer data object and the unique key field combination of ID and full name. Filtering is a way of narrowing the data set that is applied to a rule. A filter is specified in the SAP HRF rule expression language, and it can be evaluated against constant values, expressions, or input parameter values. All rules associated with a rule service will execute against the filtered dataset. I will filter my dataset to those customers with a credit rating larger than the average credit rating of all customers. If you specify an output to a rule service, the assignment of rules to that service will be limited to those that were defined with the same output. The combination of options vocabulary, output, rule assignment, and rule group will define the exact list of rules that will belong to the rule service when it is activated. Please note that specifying an output is enforced when using consumption artifacts view or procedure and view, as the output's parameters need to be added as columns of the result view. I'm going to select the output customer details as the most relevant output for this rule service. With automatic rule assignment, SAP HRF will use the characteristics of a rule to implicitly decide whether it should be assigned to the rule service or not. Characteristics such as matching output names or complementary rule group settings. Manual assignment of rules is controlled by a rule being additionally provided with a manually assigned services definition. This code block is used to specify the rule service that the rule will belong to. Manually assigned services are described in more detail within the SAP HRF Development and Implementation Guide. Rules that are manually assigned cannot be triggered by rule services that have automatic assignment. Rule groups are used to define more specifically which exact rules will join the rule service. The rule group has to be specified with valid rule expression language conditions. When a rule service or rule is activated, this condition is used to determine the rules that will be evaluated when the rule service triggers a determination process. A rule group condition is prefixed by the data object rule and can be followed by other similar keywords such as name, description, vocabulary, and rule template. This rule group will further limit the number of rules that will be assigned to the rule service. I've already created a text rule called high value customers. This rule is assigned to my new rule service as it adheres to all the rule service conditions that I have set up. As already discussed, the rule needs the following criteria. It has to have customers as part of its name. It has to belong to the rule template Banking General Rules. And also it has to reference the output customer details. The condition for the rule service specifies that the rule will only trigger for customers with an income larger than 50,000. I have also provided details of annual income, income percentile, and credit rating to my output. When I test the rule service, the rule returns the three largest earning customers, James Doherty, Emma Craig, and John Gooding. I will now edit the rule service and add a parameter to further restrict the rule output. I will set up a simple parameter for customer name. Please be aware that parameter names cannot contain spaces, and the only special character allowed is an underscore. I will make the parameter a string with a length of 200 and add the explanatory display text of enter customer name. Now I can use the parameter value within my filter condition. As you can see, the rule service now prompts me with an input parameter. Because I use the keyword contains in the rule service filter, I can add a wildcard search to my parameter value. If I specify the value as %, the wildcard search will return results of all eligible customers. By altering the parameter value to J%, I will get results for just James Doherty and John Gooding. If I change the parameter again, I can restrict the result solely to Emma Craig. There is one more option that is available to the rule service editor that I have not yet described. I can show you this using a different rule service called product list. When I execute this rule service, it produces 4 output result records, 2 for checking accounts and 1 each for credit card and mortgage products. I will now edit the rule service and show you input parameters of type data object. This parameter type creates rule service input parameters for each attribute of a data object. The function of the data object parameter type is to allow users to model and experiment with data on a temporary basis. Please note that the data belonging to the input parameters is transient. It is included in rule results, but does not exist beyond the rule service determination. It is memory based and does not get permanently stored in the SAP HANA database. Data that is held in the input parameters is merged with any existing data retrieved from the database table or view associated with the data object. There are 2 ways this data is merged. If the input parameter data record does not match to an existing data record, an additional new record is created. Secondly, if the input parameter data record does match an existing data record, then the input parameter values are used to replace the original values. If an input parameter is empty, then the corresponding existing data value is retained. I can show you this later on in this lesson. I now need to select one or more identifiers from the input parameters. These parameters are used to instruct the determination engine how to merge the input parameter data with existing data. The values entered for each parameter chosen as an identifier must exactly match the same values in the existing data in order for the existing record to be replaced by the input parameters record. If one or more identifier values do not match, the input parameter values will be treated as an additional new record. I've selected parameters ID and description as my identifiers, and I will now save the rule service. You can see that I now get prompted to enter data against my data object parameters. I will add data for 2 sets of parameters. I've set up the first parameter set with an existing ID and description. I've deliberately left the introduction date parameter empty. The second parameter set has an existing ID value of P0040, but the description is different from the original record. When I execute this rule service, you can see that the record with ID P0010 has overwritten the original data, as it has changed the target market description from mid-market to basic. However, the record has retained the original introduction date value without replacement because I left that parameter empty. The record I entered with ID P0040 has been added as a new data record due to the identifier parameter description being a different value from the original record. The rule now returns 5 results instead of the previous 4, as both records with product ID P0040 now coexist. If I now remove the parameter entries from the rule service and execute the service again, it is apparent that the rule results revert to the previous data that was held in SAP HANA. The data that I had entered through the input parameters has not been saved. Thank you for viewing this lesson. I hope it has been useful to you. Please look out for the next lesson we have planned for this series that will be an introduction to HRF rule templates.